I think I know almost everybody, but I'm Kat Imhoff, President and CEO here for the Montpelier Foundation. And I did want to do a few shout outs. Dennis Kernahan, who is turning off his phone. Thank you, Dennis, is our Vice Chair and Treasurer. And John Sponsky is somewhere. He's one of our emeritus board members. It's wonderful to have him. And then one of my old bosses, I'm looking for him, Senator Calhoun. Where are you? Wait, there he is. So I just wanted to say howdy and welcome. It is such a real opportunity on my part to be able to introduce Noah Feldman, who is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at Harvard's Law School and author, and who you're going to hear from, The Three Lives of James Madison. And he is here with his son Jaden, who is in the back and was on the your weekly constitutional this morning with his father. So we're really going to look forward to hearing that. And Mina is also, his daughter is visiting Montpelier. Well, we have in this room a really dedicated group of history buffs. And in fact, I wanted to let you know, this is one of the President's Days where we have people who have driven from New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Massachusetts, and Maryland. So this just isn't in the hood anymore. Our hood has gotten a lot bigger in these parts. And we've been so excited about this book. We've described it. These are big, weighty words. It's Ketchum quality and caliber scholarship. And around Montpelier, that means a lot to us. We've been really lucky at Montpelier to have these top Madison scholars in the country intimately involved in this great project. And the late Ralph Ketchum, who died last year, was a very active and longtime board member here. And currently Jack Rakoff has kind of picked up his mantle and continues that conversation at the board level. We've also had in recent years, and I think many of you have been at these talks, scholars like Lynn Cheney, Richard Brookhiser, David O. Stewart, Joseph Ellis, and most recently John Meacham. And they've been here to talk to us about Madison, their book projects, research, and also have been talking to us about the ideas and the conflicts of the founding era, which still reverberate in our society and in our government today. I think this is probably my favorite part of the job, is this opportunity, this excuse to read these extraordinary books, listen to these authors, and hear from them why Madison matters, still matters. And I'm not sure if it's really whether it's the timing or the fact that my understanding has continued to evolve as you get a chance to hear these different ideas put forth. But reading Noah's book right now has really been exhilarating. It's beautifully written, and it explains a lot about the centrality of Madison's understanding of freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, to the way that Madison views the protection of natural and individual rights in general. And the book is filled with lots of good writing and quotable gems, but there's just one I wanted to share with you this afternoon. And it's what I think makes Madison so interesting, but also so misunderstood. Noah writes, "If the Constitution was a new kind of governmental physics, Madison was its Newton or its Einstein." So he's referring specifically to the way that Madison understood the gravitational balance between the federal and state powers, but he's also placing Madison in an intellectual conversation that is less in line with what we typically think about as kind of political philosophy, and much more similar to kind of scientific genius. We struggle all the time calling Madison the father of the Constitution. Sometimes it just sounds a little too grand, even though that's what they said in his own lifetime. And sometimes it gives Madison both too much and too little credit for all of his accomplishments. So it's very exciting to have a new young voice in this conversation to help us contextualize Madison's legacy for not only a generation of academics and students, but for readers like all of us in this room. So Noah's list of accomplishments is long and incredibly impressive, but I just want to tell you a little bit about him. First, he's a comparative constitutional scholar, a graduate of Yale Law School, and he went on to serve as law clerk for U.S. Supreme Court David Souter. And it's also worth noting that he graduated summa cum laude from Harvard University with a degree in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, and was selected as a Rhodes Scholar, continuing his academic work in Oxford. Now, I'm not just sharing this just kind of go, look at all his fabulous accomplishments, though fabulous they are. I'm telling you this as background to really offer some context to why he was chosen in 2003 to serve as the senior constitutional advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. And he subsequently advised the members of the Iraqi Governing Council on drafting the Transitional Administrative Law, their interim constitution. So think about this, trying to write a constitution on behalf of a country in chaos while you're in your 30s. Does it remind you of anybody? So at Montpelier, we're trying to keep James Madison's legacy alive by connecting his greatest ideas to today's most important conversations about freedom and rights. President's Day and every day of the year, it's about digging into our universal pursuit for a more perfect union and a more just society. So it gives me the greatest pleasure to introduce Noah Feldman, our 2018 President's Day speaker.
Thank you so much, Kat, for that extremely generous introduction. It's really a deep honor to be here with all of you. I'm especially pleased for two reasons. One, that the extraordinary educators and archivists here at Montpelier really helped me tremendously in the very long and sometimes painful process of writing this book. And they were generous with their time, encouraging, supportive. When they had to correct me, they did it gently and politely, so that, and above all, privately. And I really benefited hugely from their help. And the resources, the intellectual resources, quite apart from the very beautiful physical plant here, but the intellectual resources of the Montpelier staff were really extraordinary and are extraordinary. So this is an opportunity for me to express my gratitude, so thank you very much. The other reason I'm really excited to be here is that I know I'm in a room full of people who care about Madison. So if you've come on President's Day to Montpelier, to say nothing if you've come from Ohio, all the way here, then you're not in need of a Madison 101 speech. And that's a pleasure for me, because when one goes out and speaks about a book, of course there are always different layers of generality at which you can discuss it. And I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to speak today with you a little bit about the ideas in the book and about Madison's life, in the sense of sharing my thoughts with a group of people who are similarly committed to and care about Madison. So that's just an exciting thing for me. It's a busman's holiday, if you will. It's a busman's President's Day. So what I'd like to do, with your permission, in the time that we have, is... Did I lose my microphone? No. There we go. Is to begin by trying to describe to you what I think is a different way of, if this doesn't work, I'll just go up behind there and talk from the, all right, it doesn't do that. All right, it doesn't like me. I had a grand plan to be at ground level, but. How's that? Is that, maybe someone have to turn this back on. Is this turn on?
Yeah. Little red button all the way to the bottom. Calling central services.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, what I'd like to do is begin by speaking about, this is even movable, but begin by speaking to you about what I think is a slightly different perspective on Madison's life and career, including his career as president, than has been presented in some other previous writing. And to emphasize a few themes that I think are illuminating about Madison's life, some of which may resonate for you in the present world as well. One thing I think that is important to note, though, is that even if one wanted to use Madison for contemporary politics, he would not, nor would his contemporaries, map neatly onto today's political divisions or debates. As it turns out, and I hope this will become clear through my comments, nobody today owns Madison, and nobody really could. Almost everybody would want to, but nobody actually could pull that off, given the way his own career went. So let me start by just describing the big arc of Madison's life as I see it. And I see it as dividing pretty neatly into 3 chapters, or 3 lives, which is why I call the book The 3 Lives of James Madison.
The first life is his life as the genius inventor of the key structures of the US Constitution. We're all familiar with what those structures are, but it's good to remember just how original and new they all were. The idea that there could be a central national government that governed individuals, even while those individuals continued to be governed by state governments, was not merely a radical innovation. It was firmly believed by the best contemporary thinkers to be logically impossible. So when I say logically impossible, that's not meant as a rhetorical exaggeration. The idea that there might be a sovereign inside a sovereign, or as they like to say in fancy Latin, imperium in imperio, was described as the great solecism, the great logical impossibility. And the reason was twofold. First, that people believed that the definition of a sovereign was the highest possible authority. So if you're the highest possible authority, there can't be another highest possible authority beneath you. There can only be one, by definition. So in that sense, it was thought to be impossible to combine sovereignties. Second, it was thought to be practically impossible because of the inevitability of fighting and conflict between the different sovereigns. Both of these were powerful insights. Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote in an interesting opinion some years back that, quote, the framers split the atom of sovereignty. Now, Justice Kennedy loves himself a good metaphor, and this one might potentially be in some ways overblown, but it's correct, no pun intended, but it's correct in that it actively compares the splitting of something that was thought to be unsplittable before. Now, the structure of federalism that we're accustomed to is not just defining for the United States, but for all other federal systems in the world, which includes not just close by countries like Canada or other countries that share Anglo-American heritage like India, but also, like Australia, but India itself, the world's largest democracy with more than 1 billion people, which could not function, would not be imaginable without a structure of federalism. And that structure of federalism is genuinely derived from Madison's thinking. In that sense, Madison is not just an important American figure, he's a global figure for the history of constitutionalism. And in that way alone, he's had a much greater global impact than I would say any of the other founders. We could have a debate, and if you'd like in the Q&A, I'm happy to have that debate, about the relative importance of the different founders within the United States. It's sort of a fun debate to have, and my guess is there's a home audience here that will be a little less hostile to my take on the subject than might be the case if we were just down the road at what we'll call the other place. But with respect to global impact, there isn't even an argument to be had. And that, I think, is not a small matter to take on board. And Madison, who was in general an extremely modest person, I think it would be no exaggeration to say he was the most modest person ever to be president of the United States, a person who hated public speaking, didn't like to run for office, was always happier working behind the scenes, was immodest in the sense that he was realistic about one thing and one thing only, and that was the tremendous impact of the constitutional design on the world, even though it had not yet had that impact. He anticipated that it would. And he told his colleagues already in 1787 in Philadelphia at the beginning of the long hot summer, before it was still the spring, in fact, before they knew how long it would last, before they knew how brutal it would get, that the future of Republican government, with a small r, lay in the balance in the convention that they were having. He knew it, they knew it, and Madison believed he had found a fix to the problem of the relationship between small, independent entities like the states and their capacity to hold together as a single national government. And as you know, crucial to his belief that he had found a fix was the idea that this new central government would be able to limit and constrain what the states were able to do, specifically the tyranny of the majority within the states. Now, Madison's lesson in reality, which is one of the most important themes in my book, his recognition that having the best idea in the world did not mean that that idea would work in practice or be adopted, began already over the course of the summer. And in particular, there was a crucial piece of Madison's grand theory that he had going into the convention that he no longer had leaving the convention. And that was his plan for a national veto power. In his view, Congress had to have the authority to veto anything that any of the state governments were going to do that Congress did not like. I mean, take a deep breath and take that on board. And that slight feeling you have of, that doesn't seem like such a good idea, was shared by essentially every other delegate in the convention. And although Madison brought this up, I counted 7 separate times that he brought it up just on the floor of the convention. He lost on this point, again and again and again. Now, notice why he lost, and notice why he thought it was necessary. He wanted to solve the problem of the tyranny of the majority. The main place where majorities tyrannized over minorities was in the states. Now, Madison had a 2-part solution. Part 1 was to create a national government that would broaden the sphere, enlarge the sphere, Madison's famous insight, and would therefore be less likely to be captured by special interests who would tyrannize as a faction over the minority in the particular entity. He got that because he got Congress with a real, genuine central government. But that didn't solve the problem of tyrannizing over the majority within the states. The only way he could solve the problem he began with, namely the problem of the tyranny majority in the states, was if this new national government that would not be factional, would not have any political parties in it, you see where I'm going here, would have the capacity to block faction or party, faction and party are the same word for Madison, at the state level. So Madison left the convention actually remarkably depressed about the 2 aspects of the Constitution. One, the fact that the small states had staged a walkout and obligated the creation of the Senate, where the small states had as much power as the large states. Madison thought this was a terrible idea, and I'd be happy to talk in the Q&A about why he got this wrong. He was convinced going in it wouldn't happen, and in retrospect that was very foolish judgment, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. But the other thing that he was very frustrated by was the loss of this national veto, because it meant his new, grand, philosophically designed plan only addressed half the problem. Now, he also was a practical politician, so when he sat down with Hamilton to write the Federalist Papers, at a time when they were so close that they were literally finishing one another's sentences, he wrote in Federalist number 10 a defense of his new theory of enlarging the sphere, where he just ignored, pretended not to notice, passed right over the fact that the system had no cure to tyranny of the majority at the state level. Now he told the grand story of ambition counteracting ambition, as he says later in the Federalist Papers, of the mechanism where enlargement would reduce the likelihood of any one faction or political party emerging. And he just told it about the story about how the national government would be better than the state governments, without mentioning that the problem he was worried about at the state level would continue. That itself showed that Madison could be practical, and what I call his first political life ended with successful ratification. At that point, Madison had had an inkling that things might be more complicated in real life than they were in theory. But compared to what he was about to encounter, it was really just an inkling. What he encountered when he went to serve in Congress was that Alexander Hamilton, who, as you probably know, had very little to say at the convention in Philadelphia. How many people here saw or have heard the soundtrack of the Hamilton musical? So some of you. This does not appear anywhere in the musical. Hamilton gave a speech at the convention where he advocated monarchy for the United States as the only viable form of government. He didn't hide the ball. He didn't refer to it obliquely as that thing they do in England. He just said, for a country of this size, only a constitutional monarchy can work. And the crowd looked at him a little bit blankly, and Hamilton responded by leaving the convention for about 6 weeks. Didn't come back till the end. He was done. Centrally important in ratification, because now he saw a common interest with Madison in getting ratification through, and Madison at that time thought that they were on the same page. They weren't. As Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton introduced his grand theory, which was essentially to do for finance what Madison had done for government. And his plan had 3 components. Component 1, I'm going to move back to the center just in the hopes of not having this go in and out sound-wise. Maybe that'll be a little bit better. Part 1 of Hamilton's plan was a national debt that he tactfully described as immortal and perpetual. And in his view, that was a good thing. It was a good thing because it would help drive the creation of a bond market, a financial market, where debt would be traded, and that would in turn be managed by the second part of his grand plan, a national bank. And the effect of this would be to give the government enough incentive to raise taxes to pay off its debts that the government would be able to do things. He wanted a big, active central national government, and the main thing he wanted it to do was to transform the United States from an agricultural republic into a modern, industrialized, manufacturing powerhouse. The Industrial Revolution had already begun in Britain, and Hamilton felt very strongly that it should be encouraged to happen in the United States, and he wanted to provide active incentives in the form of subsidies to American industry in order to do it. Madison looked at all 3 of these components, and one was worse than the next. He was horrified. And so in the second phase of his political life, he became a partisan. And he became a partisan despite himself. Some of you are probably familiar with the great historian Richard Hofstadter's description of the Constitution as, quote, a constitution against political parties. That is to say, part of Madison's original genius was to design a system that would not involve political parties at the national level. Faction was a party, and a faction was bad, and could be avoided through the enlargement of the sphere. The same person, the same genius who had this idea, became the founder, with Thomas Jefferson, of the first major political party in the United States. Now, how did he justify this? He justified it very straightforwardly. He and Jefferson were forming a party, but they only were forming that party to defeat the very idea of party itself. And although it sounds funny, and it is funny seen from a certain historical perspective, for them it was deadly serious. They believed that Hamilton and the Federalist Party, which was coming into being, was an enemy of republicanism. That is to say, it was trying to subvert and destroy the very idea of a Republican Constitution and turn the United States into a monarchy along British lines. By the way, also a monarchy that would be aligned with Britain. And as far as Jefferson and Madison could see, George Washington was slowly but surely being brought along with Hamilton's plans and was actually becoming a partisan Federalist. And so although at the beginning of his term in Congress, Madison was very close with Washington, I mean, so close that when Washington gave his first official address to Congress, Madison drafted it for him. Then Madison drafted Congress's response to Washington's address. Then he drafted Washington's response to Congress's response to his address, and then he actually, believe it or not, did draft a response by Congress. So he was literally having a discourse with himself. That was how close they were. By the end of Washington's presidency, Madison and Washington were no longer on speaking terms. Because ultimately, Madison took his strategy of accusing the Federalists of violating the Constitution, a strategy that he began by directing it at Hamilton over the Bank of the United States, which Madison declared was inherently unconstitutional, and extended that to criticizing some of Washington's efforts to, among other things, declare that the United States would be neutral in a war as between Britain and France, even though we had a treaty of amity signed with France. So seeing it this way can actually explain some weird anomalies of history, and that's actually one of the most fun things about writing a book like this, is discovering bits and pieces of our history that sound like they mean one thing, and discovering that in context they may have meant something else. So we all know Washington's famous farewell address, not the first version, which Madison actually wrote a lot of, but the one he actually gave, which Hamilton wrote, in which Washington warns us to avoid foreign entanglements. Right, very famous passage, and we all hear that and we think it sounds, slightly isolationist, and maybe in a good sense. Well, that is not how it was read at the time. According to Madison and Jefferson, this was a pure pro-British statement. Because what Washington was saying was, even though we have a treaty where we've promised France to come to its aid, let's break that treaty and not come to its aid lest we find ourselves at war with Britain. So they thought of these words in the original context not as grand advice to the American people forever, but as a local partisan intervention, and indeed, in their view, on the wrong side of history, because at this point, the French Revolution was just getting started and had not yet taken the terrible turn that it would later take. And to Jefferson and Madison, it was a model of new republicanism. In fact, Jefferson wrote to Madison, you will love everything they're doing in this revolution because they're just modeling themselves after you. And at the beginning, there was a lot of talk of constitutional design and the rights of man in ways that did seem plausibly to be following the American model. So in Madison's second life, he's a partisan, having imagined that partisanship was wrong. That's an extraordinary shift. And a lot of literature about Madison bends over backwards to try to depict Madison as though he were totally consistent between his first and his second lives. And that's just not true. Because as he began to be more and more skeptical of the Federalists, and especially during the Adams administration, when John Adams and a Federalist Congress passed the Sedition Act, which, as you know, made it a crime to criticize the government, and under which newspaper editors were arrested, fined, and jailed for multiple-year terms in an election season in the United States, taking the fake news allegation even a step further. Okay? Under President Adams, John Adams, the one everyone is meant to love from McCulloch's very well accomplished and extremely sympathetic biography, because this is something that Adams did actively in his presidency. Madison began to think that states' rights were actually a pretty good idea, because suddenly the state was one mechanism to resist the encroaching power of the federal government. So having spent his first political life arguing that the states were too powerful and needed to be constrained, and that the public needed to be subjected to governance from the center, Madison, in his second political life, as an opposition politician, became a strong advocate of states' rights. He didn't go overboard in the way that Jefferson did in his Kentucky resolutions, in which Jefferson said that the states should actively interpose themselves against federal law. But Madison's moderate version of this, which came out in the Virginia resolutions in 1798, did say that the states should declare the federal laws to be unconstitutional. So very strong states' rights position, very, very different than where Madison had been 10 years before. And in my view, that's fine. The idea that somehow the framers should have maintained perfect consistency throughout their lives implies that they were gods. But they weren't gods, they were humans. And they made the mistakes of humans, and they lived the lives of humans, and they reacted to circumstances like humans. That makes the good things they accomplished more impressive, and it makes the mistakes they made something to be grappled with and taken seriously. It's not the central theme of my talk, but I'll just mention this in passing because it's obviously hugely significant here at Montpelier. One of the issues on which Madison was consistently inconsistent throughout his life was slavery. In a document that I consider to be one of the most shocking documents anywhere in the Madison material, which I myself make a lot of in the book, Madison wrote a letter to his father from Philadelphia when he was leaving Philadelphia to return to Montpelier after serving in the Congress and the Articles of Confederation, about Billy, an enslaved person who almost certainly is the same Billy who was willed to Madison by his grandmother when he was a small child. And just a show of hands, how many people have come across the story of Billy before in this document? A good number of you. So then you'll know that in this letter, Madison first says that he can't very well bring Billy back to Montpelier because Billy has been living in Philadelphia, where slavery had been quasi-abolished, and his presence would taint the slaves here, because he would describe freedom. Then Madison goes on to say, but I can't think of selling him into transportation. That is to say, selling him to go off to either the Deep South or to the West Indies, because he says that would be a terrible thing to do to him merely for seeking that liberty, which is the right of every human, and which we fought and shed our blood for in the Revolutionary War. So I can't sell him into true slavery, because he's a human being with a right to liberty, which is a human right, Madison's terminology, and is the same right that you and I, Father James and myself, fought for in the Revolutionary War. And then he reaches a very strange compromise, which goes with a very strange reasoning, namely to sell Billy into indentured servitude so that Madison will get some value for him, not as much as he would get by selling him, and eventually Billy will become free, which is exactly what happened. And Billy did eventually become free, and married, and lived in Philadelphia, and had children until he died a few years later in a shipping accident. Seems to have fallen off of a ship. So the contradiction there is the contradiction of a human being. Someone who knows that slavery is wrong, who knows the aspiration to be free is morally correct, who does not think, unlike Jefferson, that people of African descent are inferior. He thinks they're equal. But at the same time, whose whole economic well-being is based upon the reality of slavery, who's writing to his father, whom he's constantly asking for money, because, I mean, I hope this has not happened to any of you, but Madison's the sort of young person who comes back from college and never quite gets a job. And Madison never did quite get a job. You know, I mean, in theory, he was entitled to a small salary in Congress, but the salary was so meager and the financial crisis so great that it was worth almost nothing when he could even get a hold of it. He had to borrow money extensively when he was in Philadelphia, just to survive. So he's writing to his father, whom he's always hitting up for money, and he has to explain in practical terms why he's not going to sell Billy, who's a valuable asset. So to me, this captures the humanity of somebody like Madison, not to mention the humanity of somebody like Billy. Madison is deeply conflicted. And you know what? That is part of what it is to be a human being. It's okay to say that. It's not shameful to acknowledge that there is contradiction and conflict in his life and in his thinking as there is in ours. So with that, closing that quick parenthetical, let me just turn back to Madison's last political life and his time as president, and then I'd like to open it up and we have time for a real conversation. So the Revolution of 1800, which is what you called it if you were a Republican, was an electoral victory that, according to Madison and Jefferson, meant that they had defeated the Federalists for good. Here's another example of a famous line that doesn't mean what we think it means. In his inaugural address, famously, in 1801, Jefferson said, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans." That's always quoted as a model of bipartisanship. But what Jefferson meant was, now there's only going to be one party. I mean, that was actually what it meant in context. No Federalist heard that and thought, oh, that's so nice, he's reaching out to me. Having come to power to displace Federalist values, Jefferson and Madison were faced with a deep structural foreign policy problem that in its own way was just as fundamental a problem for republicanism as the tyranny of the majority or the size of the republic had been. And that was this. When the United States declared independence in 1776, it withdrew itself from the greatest free trade zone the world had ever known, called the British Empire. The British Empire functioned as a trade union, like the European Union. And declaring independence was like a little mini Brexit. It was, from a certain perspective, a great way to assert your autonomy, and what immediately followed that was that you couldn't trade with any of your partners. And Britain shut the doors, and later when the Napoleonic War started, France dominated Europe and then shut the doors of Europe to US shipping and trade. So the central foreign policy problem that plagued and I really mean plagued the United States for the first 25 years of its existence, was how do we use enough leverage to push Britain and then France to let our ships trade? But there was a catch, because history had an answer to that, and the answer was war. You use the threat of force. But the United States faced a structural problem as a republic in the Madisonian and Jeffersonian mode. Namely, it did not have a navy to speak of, 6 frigates compared to Britain's 500 and some, nor did it have a standing army, nor could it, according to Republican principles, small r Republican principles. Why? Because everybody knew, who had studied the history of Rome, that once you had a standing army, it would cross the Rubicon, literally, and it would establish itself as an imperial guard, and you would have a Caesar, and you would not have what Arthur Schlesinger many years later called the imperial presidency. You would just have an empire full stop. Although, goodness knows, the imperial presidency would have looked to Madison in many ways very much like an empire. If you thought that you could not use the tools of war to coerce Britain and France, you needed some other solution to the structural problem. And here Madison's characteristic genius kicked in, and he came up with a theory, just like he'd come up with the theory of the Constitution. And the theory was the theory of economic sanctions. And Madison came to believe, and convinced Jefferson to believe, that the US could force Britain and France using economic sanctions to open their ports. And for 8 years of Jefferson's presidency, and the first 4 of Madison's, so for 12 years, Madison coordinated US foreign policy to use every imaginable configuration and type of economic pressure he could come up with, to try to solve in a fundamental way the question of how a republic could have international leverage. And he failed. He failed. The embargo, which was tried at the very end of the Jefferson administration, was a kind of game of chicken against Britain, and we blinked first. Refusing to export any products is a great idea because you put pressure on the other side. We put huge pressure on Britain. But of course, we're starving too because no one's buying. Okay, so a game of chicken, and we just blinked first. Then Madison got a little bit better at it. He tried to play the British and the French off against each other. But for 3.5 years of his presidency, he was unsuccessful. Remarkably, and maybe tragically, in June of 1812, the British finally succumbed to the pressure, partly for internal political reasons. They had their own trading class who wanted to be able to trade with the US, and sent a letter to the United States informing them that the so-called Orders in Council had been lifted and the US could now begin trading with British ports. Unfortunately, the same week, Madison had, in Washington, D.C., gone to Congress and asked for and received a formal declaration of war against Britain on the belief that his approach had failed. So the objective for which the War of 1812 was being fought was in fact granted within a couple of days of the declaration of war, and there but for the existence of the telegraph or a telephone or email or Twitter, began the War of 1812. A war that Madison had come to in contradiction to his belief that republicanism was incompatible with aggressive, invasive wars. Because make no mistake, the War of 1812 was an aggressive war of expansion, and it was based on a very simple strategy: invade Canada. Should have been easy to accomplish. Canada was poorly defended. The problem was that the United States had no army, and so had to rely on militia. And militia, though very good at defending home and hearth, which is what Republican theory demanded, turned out to be terrible at invading. And in episode after episode, the militia simply turned and fled, or in some instances, famously at the Niagara River, 3,000 New York militia under a general, formerly Governor Van Rensselaer, just refused to cross the river at all. So the plan to invade Canada failed, and the War of 1812 almost ended in true disaster when the British position changed completely. The British were sort of preoccupied fighting Napoleon when Madison started this war. That's why he thought he could get away with it. I mean, if you think about it in global terms, Even Madison, who was not very experienced in making war, did not think he could defeat the British Empire and the Royal Navy when they were turning their full attention to the United States. But they had the little matter of Napoleon to deal with. But in the fall of 1813, Napoleon marched into Russia with 600,000 troops, and by Christmas he had 20,000 of them left. And so, by the spring of 1814, the British position with respect to the United States was radically different. And Britain began sending battle-hardened, serious troops now to invade the United States. Most famously, this led to the burning of Washington. And suddenly, it seemed that the gamble had not only failed, but might have gone disastrously awry. And the future of the United States as an independent country was now actually in danger. And were it not for the grand and successful defense of Baltimore, so remarkably recorded by Francis Scott Key, in what was actually one of those dramatic moments on which the future of the country turned, then the United States might actually have ceased to be as an independent entity. This was another thing that I was sort of amazed to discover. I had, like most people, not delved very deeply into the War of 1812 before I had to do it. And I don't think I really understood that the Star-Spangled Banner, I understood it depicted some important military moment, but I didn't realize that it actually depicted the moment at which the War of 1812 was going to be lost or won. And that happened just a week or two after the burning of Washington. Washington was of no great strategic significance. It was symbolically bad to have it burned. It didn't matter strategically, and the British marched in and out within 24 hours. They came in, they burned it, they left. Baltimore was where the action was. That was a port city, and a very well-defended port city. Washington was essentially undefended. Baltimore had an enormous fort at its harbor, and substantial city defenses hastily erected, defended by militia. And the British bravely and valiantly tried to take the beach and failed. And so that moment that was captured by Francis Scott Key, in which the flag was not, the colors were not struck, was actually the moment in which Baltimore survived, which shifted the strategic balance and told the British they could put an end to the war, which they in fact did do, settled on a draw. And somehow that draw came to seem like a victory because things had gotten so bad. And Madison left office the most popular president in US history at the time. There's a remarkable letter from Adams to Jefferson at the end of Madison's presidency, where he says, you know, regardless of whatever mistakes Madison may have made, and there were many, he has left the United States with greater glory and greater honor accomplished during his presidency than in yours presidency, my presidency, and Washington's presidency combined. And that was the judgment of the age, right? So there were two other living presidents, one was telling the other that Madison's presidency had been greater than that of either of them or of Washington himself. Extraordinary, and I think accurate from the standpoint of the time. We, I think, sometimes have fallen into the habit of underselling Madison's presidency because it was so close to disaster. But to his contemporaries, the presidency was actually seen as having been a substantial success and consolidating Republican authority. And we remained, in the era of good feelings, essentially a one-party state for another 12 or 16 years. So again, this last stage of Madison's life is a story of the journey from optimism and theory to realism and hard-won experience. And to me, that's an important lesson for us to keep in mind in our own political world. Theories are great, and Madison was one of the greatest theorists of all time in his chosen domain of constitutional thought. I think he was the greatest constitutional theorist of all time. But real-world politics matter. And constitutions are won and lost, and nations live or die in the real-world politics that follows the beauty of the Constitution. And Madison had both. Last but not least, and Kat and I were talking about this last night, this question of Madison's legacy relative to some of the other founders. Madison didn't have some enormous monument built to him in Washington, D.C., nor really would he have wanted it. What he wanted was for the Constitution itself to be his monument. It's sort of like Sir Christopher Wren in St. Paul's Cathedral. If you seek his monument, runs the plaque, look around you. If you seek Madison's monument, look around you and see a 230-year-old functioning Constitution. Not perfect, never perfect, not perfect from day one. Some religious denominations believe it to be religiously and divinely inspired. Perhaps. That's, luckily for me, above my pay grade. But if divinely inspired, not divinely designed. You know, full of anomalies, full of mistakes, full of illogic, and more extraordinary than anything else the world has ever known. That's pretty good. I would say that's good enough. And it certainly would have been good enough from Madison's perspective. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm very eager to hear your comments, your questions, and to have a real conversation.
Your helper this evening or this afternoon is Doug Smith, the VP for the Center for the Constitution. So since the mic is working here, we'll just stay right here.
Okay, Doug, are you calling on people or am I?
Well,
he's going to hand off the mic.
I'm going to hand off the mic. Now, if
You're in charge.
If there's someone you don't want me to hand the mic to.
Everyone is welcome to speak and encouraged to speak.
Magnificent talk. I was wondering about your views of the fourth age of Madison, which you haven't spoken about, his correspondence with Calhoun in the nullification crisis. Did he yet make another change, or was he faithful to his earlier views?
Thank you for that. Thank you for saying so, and thank you for the really interesting question. One reason I didn't spend a lot of time in the book, in fact, on this fourth phase, is that there's a tremendously good book about it. So some of you may have heard of Drew McCoy's book. I know it's for sale in the bookshop. And that's an extraordinary book that doesn't start until Madison retires and comes back here. And it's a very detailed and sophisticated account of Madison's involvement in the growing sense through the country that something like partition or civil war was a possibility. So the stakes of this are hugely high because, as I like to tell my students, there's a textbook definition of failure for a constitution, and that's civil war. There's other ways a constitution can fail, but the textbook example is if you've got a civil war, your constitution failed. Which is why I don't spend a lot of time talking about every aspect of my Iraq experience, which, fascinating though it was, you know, the early Iraqi constitutional efforts produced a functioning document that in certain respects has functioned, but it didn't manage to head off a really brutal insurrection and really civil war that lasted, you know, the better part of 3 years and very tragically in Iraq. So the answer is, in my view, that Madison tried to say as clearly as he could that during the nullification debate, that above all, he wanted the country to stay together, and that all he had ever been for in 1798 was for the states to be able to announce that a law was unconstitutional, not to actually block its implementation. I believe that was, in fact, his view at the time. It was not Jefferson's view, and Madison knew it had not been Jefferson's view, and Jefferson was dead by the time this debate took place, and Madison, playing a role that he had played for Jefferson in his lifetime, moderated, apologized for, controlled, and undersold Jefferson's insights. At one point, in something he wrote for the North American Review, which was the most widely read publication in the United States among educated people at the time, he went so far as actually to assert, falsely, that Jefferson, or inaccurately, I suppose one should say, that Jefferson had never advocated, even in the Kentucky resolutions, for active nullification. Then, a year or so later, in a footnote, he admitted that was not the case. And I have trouble believing that Madison didn't remember it. But Madison was trying to defend Jefferson's reputation. You know, Jefferson was genuinely brilliant in the sense that he always had the grandest formulation available at his fingertips, and he always went for it. He never thought about long-term consequences. And Madison's career has episode after episode after episode, and they're shot through this book, in which he's covering for some extremely brilliant and crazy thing that Jefferson has said. And that's exactly what Madison's comment, what Madison was trying to do for Jefferson after his death with respect to nullification. Happy to give some more examples of that if people are interested.
This is somewhat related, I guess. I've never seen this. I seem to have seen something to the effect that when Jefferson and Madison watched the evolution of Hamilton's development of the national bank and taking over the debt of all the states, they then realized that the Constitution was a far more powerful document to create a national government than they had anticipated. And that at a political level, not necessarily a social level, but a political level, the impact it could eventually have on changing slavery in the South could make that happen. And from their standpoint, at a political level, that was a disastrous political consequence. I'm just curious if you saw anything along those lines in your work.
Well, I think partly yes and partly no. Yes, in that it's absolutely the case that as Hamilton began to implement point after point of his plan, Madison, especially, Jefferson was also there, but Madison in particular was horrified by the kind of governing power that the national government was getting. And that led him to start coming up with explanations for why it couldn't do this. And he invented large parts of our constitutional theory today in reaction to Hamilton. So take the idea that the government is a government of limited powers, that Congress's powers are limited by an enumeration of specific powers in Article 1, Section 8. That had been mentioned very briefly in half a line in the Federalist. It had come up occasionally in the ratification debates. But mostly what Madison was trying to do in ratification, and mostly what he and Hamilton were trying to do in the Federalist Papers, was to convince people that the new government would have sufficient power to do what it needed to do. Not to warn them or to defend them against the fear that it would have too much power. When the national bank was introduced, Madison, in his final speech against it, not in his first view, but in his final speech against it, suddenly articulated for the first time a thoroughgoing theory of government of enumerated powers and a list of enumerated powers to Congress, and said, bank's not in there. So Professor Richard Primus at University of Michigan Law School, a good friend of mine, has just written a paper, I don't know if it's out yet, but I saw an advanced version of it, where he argues in pretty convincing detail that Madison was refining and developing this idea of enumerated powers only in reaction to Hamilton's overreach. So the part where I agree with the suggestion is that there's no doubt that this was an extraordinary wake-up call for Madison and for Jefferson. The part that I think is perhaps less consistent with the data that I've seen is that they were worried about slavery. The federal government, even on Hamilton's view, would not have had the authority to do anything about slavery. The slave trade was guaranteed until 1808 in the Constitution. And slavery was perceived as a form of state law, property law, that different states might have different norms about, and that couldn't be affected by the Constitution itself. And as Madison had argued in the Virginia ratifying convention, it's a bit embarrassing, but I believe in a warts and all account, the Fugitive Slave Clause, which Madison was not especially in favor of at the original Philadelphia Convention, was a nice guarantor that there would never be abolition of slavery. Because even if a northern state abolished slavery, it would still be obligated under the Fugitive Slave Clause to return escaped slaves back to the slave states from whence they came. And that was actually orthodox constitutional law until Lincoln. And Lincoln himself held the view until quite late in the war that he lacked, and Congress lacked, the constitutional authority to take away people's slaves, because the slaves were property, and the Constitution expressly protected your property rights. Congress could not take away your property rights without due process of law. That would be an unconstitutional taking. And so I don't think they were very worried about the institution of slavery in particular. Only because they thought slavery had been adequately protected by the Constitution already. There was a hand up here.
Thank you. You equated faction with political party. But in the past, I've thought of faction as being manufacturers versus shippers, or debtors versus creditors. Could you explain a little bit how you can see faction as being the same thing as the political party?
Yeah, so we're both right, and let me explain why. By going back a little bit into Madison's theory of what political parties were and where they came from. So you're completely correct that when Madison tried to explain what a faction was, he began with a definition. A faction was any group of people united to advance their own interests over the good of the people as a whole. Notice that you still have to know what the good of the people of the whole is, but he had no skepticism that he would be able to identify it. And then he said, such factions arise almost by necessity because of people's economic interests. And then he uses the examples that you mentioned. There are creditors and debtors. There are manufacturers, and there are people who pursue agriculture. And he gives a set of different varying economic interests and says these things are the reasons that people begin to have differing views from each other that pursue their own interests over those of the people as a whole. What he believed was that the formation of political parties came into existence by virtue of these economic interests being allied, and groups of people with common economic interests deciding to join up and create essentially a team to fight on a range of issues in the legislature. This is exactly how he saw the Federalist Party. And in a very extremely far-sighted and innovative essay that he wrote in the national press when he was founding the Republican Party, and I should say parenthetically, that partly involved him in creating a Republican newspaper. There were Federalist newspapers, and there were Republican newspapers. Each accused the other of being fake news. The division was near absolute. You know, the MSNBC versus Fox division is nothing new. You know, in fact, what's remarkable is that we ever had a period of time in our nation's history where people didn't think of the media as profoundly partisan and political. And this partisanship, just still in this parentheses, this partisanship was so deep that in the Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic of 1793, the one where Dolly lost her first husband and her baby, there were even two different doctors, a Republican doctor and a Federalist doctor, each advocating his own cure for the yellow fever. And people would say, are you taking the Republican cure or are you taking the Federalist cure? So, you know, even, and again, it sounds crazy to us. Who could imagine that a political party would index with beliefs about science? Well, okay, so the kind of partisanship that emerged there, according to Madison, was, in his view, economically driven. So as Madison put it, if you wanted to see where federalism comes from, follow the money, he says in this essay. And he traces it back to British capital. Remember, throughout this period, the United States suffered very much from a lack of its own capital. Cash was the constant driving serious problem. So a lot of capital came from Great Britain. And then, Madison says in this essay, follow the capital. It comes to the port cities, where the British are doing business with traders, lending money to those traders in order for those traders to buy from them. The traders then, in turn, import goods, and they lend money down the big trading routes down the rivers. And so on deep into the heart of the country, with Federalist support, according to Madison, going wherever there were, and he uses this example, advertisers, merchants who wanted to purchase advertising to encourage these same businesses, therefore supporting Federalist newspapers. So it's also a very early and insightful account of how the political economy of the country shapes the media. And, you know, this is just an essay he wrote in the late, in the early 1790s. It's one of a series of essays that he wrote in the National Intelligencer, laying out the theory of what would become the Republican Party. So this essay shows you that in Madison's view, the Federalist Party was an economic interest party. which predominated among the rich, and not the agricultural rich, but the coastal rich, people who made their money by manufacturing and trade, and were therefore in close business relations with Britain, and therefore needed Britain for accruing capital, and wanted to make the United States more closely aligned with Britain. In contrast, in his account, the Republican Party was the party of, as far as he was concerned, the common people, ordinary people, primarily farmers, though to some degree, small artisans in the bigger cities who didn't require the accrual of large amounts of capital to do their business. Coincidentally, it was also the party of large agricultural holders like Madison himself, but of course he downplayed that. And again, its party interests were very much not aligned with the idea of financial markets. You know, when financial markets started to arise, for example, when subscriptions to own stock in the Bank of the United States were spread, which was the first IPO craze in American history, you had to buy something called a subscription, shortened to scrip, in order to be able to participate in the IPO. So to get access to the IPO, you had to buy this scrip. So a market rose in this scrip, and it created a bubble very, very fast, and then it collapsed. And Madison, traveling home from Philadelphia, observed how wherever he went, all people could talk about in the coffee shops was scrip and the value of scrip, until he got to Virginia. And in Virginia, the rich, those with money to do this, just weren't buying it. They just couldn't believe that investing in the stock, investing in financial markets was a respectable or plausible way to get rich. And Hamilton was sort of annoyed by this. He was thinking maybe we have to find some way actually to sell the scrip more in Virginia, because he wanted elites everywhere in the country to be co-opted into his schemes. Now, seen from the perspective of economic sophistication, the Republican rich were wrong about this. Right? I mean, lots of wealth, it turned out, could be made in the markets. And indeed, the big landholders, this is a story you all know very well, of Madison's generation, like Washington, like Jefferson, were losing money in agriculture. When they really happened to make money, it was typically money that they made in land speculation. They did badly in agriculture. This was certainly the story here at Montpelier, where there was no successful cash crop ever in the period after Madison's presidency. This is parenthetically also one of the reasons that Madison and Hamilton thought that slavery would disappear. They didn't think it was economically viable. And in Virginia, arguably, it wasn't. It was only the invention of the cotton gin and the shift of slavery to further south, to the cotton states, that made slavery economically advantageous and attractive, and then created the radically different economic interests that helped to lead ultimately to the Civil War, and also, of course, created a huge transformation in the nature of slaveholding, with greater and greater amounts of labor having to be extracted, or being extracted, by more and more brutal forms of enslavement, and I think one could call it torture in many cases without pushing the envelope of how we understand that term, which is a very different form of slavery than ever had existed in Virginia, or certainly than existed here or in Monticello. That's not to say anything in defense of the forms of slavery that are here. I'm just trying to explain why it was that, among other things, Madison and Jefferson could think that slavery would pass away. And again, to come back to the theme of their humanity, they were wrong. They didn't foresee the technological change and the effects that that would have. So, it's a long way of getting at the response. Madison did think that political parties were born originally of economic interest. He understood, though, that once they began that way, ideology would be added on. And we can all see this operating in politics today. Lots of instances of partisan politics do seem to be indexed with people's economic interests. But then there's a whole overlay of, I would call them, values issues, which don't necessarily align with people's economic interests, that also do a lot of work. And I would say in a, relatively speaking, rich and relatively speaking evolved democracy like ours today, there's more and more room for ideology in politics. As people are doing better and better relative to impoverishment, that sort of gives you more space to allow ideology to play a role in your politics. especially if the two parties' positions on economic distribution are not the same, but are not radically different, as they might be, for example, in lots of Western European countries or other places in the world. So, I mean, I don't want to go too far afield to our contemporary world, but I think the depth of ideology that we see in politics was present in Madison's world, but it was more closely aligned with economic interests then than it appears to be in the United States today. I would also add that the apparent non-alignment of economic interest and political ideology in the United States today is a real problem for political scientists to understand. It's one of the deepest problems that we face. It just doesn't fit any of the models that are designed to cover most forms of political affiliation, such as we have known about them in the entirety of the modern period. So Madison's case is Madison's argument is sort of the mainstream argument. It's our case with its own quirky weirdness that makes it harder to see. One last thought about, there are more hands, go ahead. I don't want to go on for too long. I see a hand right over here. Okay, two more questions. I want to make sure that we get to you and you start.
Yes, sir. Can you comment a little bit more on the role of piracy in the absence of in America finding itself upon independence out from under the mantle of the Royal Navy? The impact of piracy on the constitutional debates and its legacy that continued right through Washington's shipbuilding program, Jefferson and Madison finally sending a victory fleet at the very end of his administration. But it forced a lot of anti-federalists into becoming federalists, particularly at the time of trying to find an agreement for the Constitution. But those dynamics continued. Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think you framed the issue very, very well. One of the good things about being part of this tremendous trade union of the British Empire was that it came with the biggest navy in the history of the world, and that was a pretty effective mechanism for protecting shipping. The minute you Brexit, reverse Brexit, you don't have that protection anymore. And in particular, this was relevant on the Barbary Coast, that is to say in the Mediterranean, where US shipping became susceptible to the same techniques that were used against everybody's shipping who was from a country that didn't have a major navy, namely an arrangement in which the Northern African powers gave essentially commissions to ships. As far as they were concerned, they were corsairs and privateers. We, of course, call them pirates. But they were carrying national flags and they had national authorization to essentially extract tribute. I mean, the name of this game was this is not piracy in the form of, it's not the Pirates of the Caribbean form of piracy, where the idea is to steal, or contemporary Somali pirates, where the idea is that non-state actors are just stealing whatever they can get their hands on. This is state-sponsored actors offering enough of a threat to require shippers to pay, in essence, a very large bounty to those small city-states. And, structurally, you had two choices. You paid the tribute, or you had a navy. And Jefferson, who hated the idea of a navy, and was obsessed with the idea of these little gunboats that would have one gun on them. I mean, I have a sort of, if you look in the index of my book under gunboats, it gets funnier and funnier as it goes. I mean, by the end, Jefferson almost knows that he's a self-parody with respect to these gunboats. But Jefferson, who hated the idea of a navy, was willing to have a navy, and Madison, who didn't like the idea of going to war, was willing to go to war already from the first days of Jefferson's administration to go and send the message into North Africa that you can't mess with us. And they were encouraged by a fascinating, picturesque figure called James Cathcart, who had been a cabin boy on a ship and that was captured in the Med, had become a slave in North Africa. Slavery was very different in the Muslim world than it was here. There, a slave could rise to be advisor to the Bey or the Sultan, and he did. And he became, America's first Middle East expert. And his advice to, this will remind you of something, his advice to Jefferson and Madison was to arrange regime change in Tripoli. And so we undertook a war of regime change, literally, where we were going to substitute the brother of the Bey for the Bey. And it ended up a sort of 5.5 year, again, no shock here, 5.5-year inconclusive undertaking, cost a lot of money. We claimed some big victories. You know, the Navy, the Marines got some good publicity about it, about the shores of Tripoli, and we never really won. It also cost a lot of money. So, you know, no contemporary lessons need necessarily be drawn, but this was all because Madison and Jefferson were unprepared to say, okay, we'll pay the tribute. Right? Part of them aspired to be functioning on a global scale. And the War of 1812, in a way, is a manifestation of the same impulse. The same impulse to say, we want to be able to play with the real countries. What's really interesting, though, is that although, of course, the United States would eventually, a century later, end up very much in that role after World War I, it didn't really stick. You know, after these initial forays abroad, the U.S. sort of stuck to expansion first across our continent and then within our hemisphere, and didn't try out major wars with, you know, European hemispheric powers really until the First World War, and even then had to be sort of dragged into it. So, you know, one thing is sometimes people say to me, aren't we such a very Hamiltonian country? And I say, well, in certain respects, no doubt we are, but that's not necessarily because of Hamilton. Because these things didn't happen in Hamilton's lifetime. They didn't happen in the next 50 years after Hamilton. Some of them took 100 years after Hamilton. Madison actually left a much bigger impact in that time than Hamilton did, because the country more or less bought the Republican view of things, not the Federalist view of things. Eventually, something that looks more like the Federalist view did emerge on all these fronts. But it may be simply that the country wasn't in a historical state of being ready for that. And in that sense, Hamilton was ahead of his time, but also repudiated to a great degree. Last question, please.
This isn't quite on the subject. I've heard for many years that James Madison was famous for jokes. In your research, have you found any jokes that would be appropriate for this audience?
Well, let me first say that there's only one joke of Madison's that's not appropriate, and it turns out he never told that joke. So if any of you, I'm not going to get into it now because we are in this audience, but if any of you think that Madison told a joke in connection with the State Department's funding of the service of women of ill repute for a visiting dignitary, it turns out that never, Madison never told that joke. That's a joke, and I have a long footnote showing that although everyone reports this as a joke that Madison told, it actually is a joke told by one of Madison's early biographers. Actually, and then people took it as though he were actually attributing the joke to Madison, just a mistake. Anyway, Madison did like the after-dinner story as a genre. But the stories that he told, you know, this is what I always say about comedy and tragedy, right? Tragedy is transcendent. You know, we can watch a Greek tragedy and we cry. We can watch a Shakespearean tragedy and we cry. It's much harder to make comedy work across generations. Most of Madison's after-dinner stories, some of which were told to a man called Jared Sparks, who later went on to be the president of Harvard University. And it's of interest to me because my son and I live on Spark Street. Our family lives on Spark Street. It's named after that same Jared Sparks. They're just not that funny. I mean, maybe they were funny then, but they're just not all that funny right now. Which is sort of sad. I mean, I think I haven't said much about Dolly, and you know, I think there's really an enormous amount to be said about her. She plays a central role in the book, and I have come to believe that she was the most historically influential woman in the first 50 years of the United States. A big part of her power was that Madison was not that good on his feet in a social setting. I mean, ask someone to save the Republic, he was your guy. Come up with a new constitution, call James Madison. Get through a dinner party, you really needed Dolly, you needed, and of course politics then as now was not primarily a matter of abstractions. Politics was a matter of forming human relationships and then building them and making them work. And at a time when all of Washington, D.C. had 4,000 inhabitants, you could know everybody, and Dolly did know everybody. And the personal networks that she created throughout Washington, D.C., which were very well attested after Madison died, when she returned to Washington after a long absence, and was still the most popular and well-connected person in town, are a testament to the fact that she really ran for 16 years Madison's policy with respect to social and human interaction with all parties and with the diplomatic corps. And that's because during Jefferson's 8 years as president, Jefferson didn't have a first lady. His wife had died, and Sally Hemings, needless to say, was not with him in Washington, D.C. So, in fact, Dolly was the de facto first lady for those 8 years, and then for the 8 years of Madison's presidency. In fact, she sometimes functioned literally as the hostess at the White House for Jefferson. And one of the fake news allegations that was made designed to harm all three of them, Jefferson, Dolly, and Madison, was the allegation that Dolly had an affair with Jefferson. As far as I can make out, no evidence whatsoever of this, but it was alleged by the Federalist-affiliated newspapers, and it fit, Jefferson's reputation for being maybe a little too free with his affections, and it impugned Madison by making him look as though he was not, in the parlance of the time, man enough to control his wife. And it, of course, harmed Dolly's reputation, and that was a relevant political act because she was so politically powerful. So weakening her was intended to be significant. So, these were the kinds of political games that were played then. They're not totally unfamiliar to us today. Our generation did not invent these things, but they somehow, survived this, and I have great hope that we will survive it too.